France's President Emmanuel Macron's promised more action against what he calls radical Islam after the murder of a school teacher. But is the crackdown pitting French secularism against its second most practiced religion? This is Roundtable. Hello from me, David Foster. A mosque closed, arrests made, and dozens of organisations under investigation. And our actions will continue, says France's president. Is he simply playing politics in the hope of re-election? The murder of teacher Samuel Paty brought people onto the streets to gather in his memory and rally in support of free speech. Since the killing, a mosque in Paris has been closed for 6 months, and a Muslim group accused of involvement in the crime is to be disbanded. It is just weeks since the president announced a new law to prevent what he called Islamic separatism in France. Organisations that go against what he called republican ideas could be shut down. Religious leaders, imams, must be trained in France. French secular laws already exclude religious symbols such as headscarves from public institutions. The country is home to more Muslims than any other in Western Europe. The events of recent weeks have led many of them to ask if the idea of French secularism is being set against the religion they practice in their millions. Well, I'm very pleased to welcome from northern France, from Saint-Malo, Jacques Reland, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute. We head south, still in France, but at Toulouse. Reem Sarah Alouane, legal scholar, commentator who's researching religious freedom, human rights and civil liberties in France. And then we cross to the east coast of the United States, where we see Jonathan Laurence in Boston, professor of political science at Boston College and author of Integrating Islam, Political and Religious Challenges in Contemporary France. Jonathan, I'll ask you about those challenges in just a moment, but let's start with you, Jacques, first of all. Emmanuel Macron's come in for a great deal of criticism for supposedly attacking Islam in France. All 8 million Muslims in France, it has been said, are under attack. Is he doing that, or is he simply taking on radical Islam and extremism?
Macron is definitely not attacking Islam. He's attacking radical Islam. That was made clear in his speech on the 2nd of October, where he had a good balancing act between attacking radical Islamism, and at the same time saying that France had maybe a share of responsibility in the fact that some people felt alienated because of a lack of provisions by the French state in some of the French ghettos that we created, which made them attracted by radical Islam. But it's true that in the speech he made after the beheading of the French teacher, which is a big symbol in France, and maybe we can go back on that for why, his tone has become a bit harder, saying it's a war, they will not, we will destroy them, etc. But he's always been at pains to make sure to guarantee that he's not attacking Islam, he's attacking radical Islamism. It's been confirmed.
But that is not the way it has been represented That is not the way it's been represented by a lot of commentators, by a lot of people abroad as well.
Outside France, maybe that's the way it's not been represented. But in France, the rector of the Paris Mosque and the leaders of the French Muslim Council have clearly said that there should be a wall between Islam and Islamism. And the rector of the Paris Mosque said that Islamism is not the real Islam. It's based on the wrong reading of the sacred text, and it is a source of hatred, war, which is completely the opposite of what Islam should be, i.e. a religion of peace. So it's not attacking Islam. And France is not is anti-Islam. We saw even in the wake of the terrible attacks on the Bataclan and so on, it did not lead to a rise in Islamophobia. On the opposite, opinion polls show that the French make a big distinction between the millions of Muslims in France who practice their religion peacefully and calmly, and the minority which is trying to lead an attack on the French model, the French Republican model, the French secular model, and at the same time, the French integration model.
So can I go to Reem on this one? Because the other side of the argument is that Macron has been portrayed perhaps as being tough on Islam in general, simply so that some radicals can use that as a recruiting device and say, look, we are all under attack.
It's actually very interesting because from what I've observed, there is a difference between what Macron publicly announced, that indeed he is going after radical Islam extremism, etc., and what his ministers do. So there is this gap between the announcements of the president and his ministers. So for example, so Macron announced that he's going to be tougher and there is going to be like a fight against extremism, etc. He tweets, "We are one, we are united." But at the same time, the Minister of Education announced that he's is going after academics and university by declaring that universities is where, I quote, Islamofascism is being, taught, and where this ideology is supposedly being developed by academics, students, etc. Islamofascism, which, by the way, is a far-right ideology that has been spread and used both by the left and the right. He also accused American universities to import those theories in France, the theory of intersectionality. He probably never studied intersectionality, but he accused it of being the reasons why separatism is happening. And the Minister of Interior, who really suddenly decided to share his opinion on ethnic food aisle in supermarket and accusing capitalism of being responsible of separatism and communautarism. So actually what is very disturbing is this fuzziness. It sounds like the government is willingly kind of being fuzzy. And of course, this double discourse led to this kind of outcry.
So it's trying to appeal perhaps to two different constituencies. It's trying to appeal to those people who want to see a crackdown on radicalism, but it's also trying to appeal to those people that generally think that the Muslim community hasn't integrated properly.
But the problem is the vast majority of French Muslims just want to live their lives peacefully, and they are paying the price. French Muslims did not commit, those attacks, and yet we are going after them.
Yeah. So let's bring in Jonathan, because I want you all to have a say at the beginning of the program, and you can comment on what you've just heard so far. But I also want to ask you what you think are the political and religious challenges for Muslims in contemporary France.
Well, I would start by saying that the numbers, first of all, of how many Muslims there are in France are somewhat unclear. As you know, it's difficult to count. The estimate is around 6 million, so somewhat less than the 8 million you mentioned. However, the problems relate to the political situation in which the president finds himself, similar to those of his predecessors, aware that there is a far right in France that has not gone away. But I think the main challenge really is at the organizational, institutional level for French Muslims. I don't think that anyone would disagree. I don't think Macron or Erdogan would disagree that the killer was operating on a corrupt and vacuous interpretation of religion that has little to do with the lived religion of the 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. What I think they would differ is what to do about that. The French state has dithered for more than 2 decades in terms of setting up an actual infrastructure, which is to say the conditions for theological seminaries, the conditions for religious schools to be created that would, in effect, anchor Islam more firmly in the French country and countryside. Right now, France is heavily reliant on imported religion, imported imams, imported funding in order to build the few mosques that exist. There are many prayer spaces, but only a handful of proper mosques.
Jonathan, sorry to interrupt you. I want to ask you to explain that a little bit more, if you would. Why has France been so dilatory, so slow, in your opinion, in integrating Islam into France?
Well, so there's a colonial legacy at play here, right? France opted not to integrate Islam into the Republic or into the empire when it had the chance. Remember, it was an occupying power in North Africa for more than a century. But Islam was exempted from the law on laïcité of 1905, even though there were, of course, millions of Muslims under French rule at that time. When French Muslims migrated, migrated to France in the 60s and then settled in the 70s and 80s, there was a rise of Islamism worldwide, of course, following the Iranian Revolution and in North Africa itself during the Algerian Civil War. So Islamism, radicalism, has always been on the horizon in the background as an underlying obstacle to integration. But
I just want to go and examine laïcité, secularism, a little bit more. Jacques, yes, please.
Yeah, could add that it's also due to the law on secularity in France. The state is not allowed to interfere with the religions, to finance them. And that's one of the problems. For a long time, the Muslim religion has been underground, not many mosques and so on, but the state is not able to finance the construction of proper mosques. Instead, you have some kind of underground mosque in garages, in all kinds of places. And there's been this desire in France to create a French Islam, an enlightened Islam. But it's been difficult. We can't. It's up to the Muslims themselves to organize their religion. The French state cannot do it.
People might be wondering, if the French state cannot, as you put it, interfere, why it seems to be doing so now.
It's not interfering. It's interfering with radical Islamism, which is not seen as a religion, as I repeat, seen as a political movement rather than a religion, aimed at actually the aim of these Islamists is to try to create tensions towards Muslims in France. There's nothing that the Islamists would like better than to see Marine Le Pen arrive to power, because most of the French Muslims are quite happy in the country where they live in. They like to live in a democracy. They like to live in a country where the government is not corrupt. They like to be able to lead their life as they want. And you can say that there is a lack, maybe in many cases, of a lack of social and economic integration on the part of many people, especially living in the ghettos, in the tough areas of France.
And I want to ask, I want to bring Reem back in at this point, because you've been very patient while we've been chatting around the subject. But when it comes to laïcité, secularism, isn't that France's biggest problem, that it can't be seen to be doing anything to crack down on religious freedom, etc., or helping people to integrate by setting up mosques, etc., but by not doing so, it has created a problem for itself?
I would say that actually the biggest curse of laïcité is how it has been misunderstood and weaponized. So a couple of things. We need to come back to 1905. We have a law on separation of church and state, meaning that basically religious neutrality applies to the state and to civil servants, right? Religious neutrality does not apply to civilians, to normal citizens who are allowed to express their religion as long as they do not disturb public order. But what we have been witnessing since the 90s is how slowly the state has been trying to make religion invisible in the public space, and especially targeting Muslims. Our other guest mentioned colonialism, which is a very interesting era to study when it comes to laicity and Muslims, because at that time, Muslims in Algeria required from the government that laicity applied to them, but that would mean that equality would apply to them, something that at that time the government refused to do. And that's why another separate status was applied to them. And it seems that we are reproducing the same thing today, except that today we want laicity to be applied. We want, the French people want the state to stay out of religious affairs, and that's something we are not doing. And a reminder as well that there are territories in France where laicity does not apply for various reasons, especially historical reason. Eastern France, many of us is territory. So unfortunately, the problem with laicity is how we are not applying it at all, and this is dangerous.
Can I bring in something that was mentioned? Sorry to quieten the discussion at the moment, but I want to bring this in, which was the mention of Marine Le Pen. And then this is a quote I'm going to put up on screen by H.A. Hellier, author of Muslims of Europe, the Other Europeans. Macron's statements are simply an attempt to appeal to right-wing voters ahead of the 2022 presidential election, where he's currently polling neck and neck with far-right National Rally leader Marine Le Pen, who is not afraid to blame Muslims for all of France's ills. So how, Jonathan, you can pick this one up. How does Emmanuel Macron differentiate himself from Marine Le Pen in this bid to appeal to right-wing voters and to paint the Muslim community as something that needs to be confronted?
Well, you could say the low-hanging fruit has already been picked by his predecessors. A headscarf ban in primary and secondary schools was accomplished under the presidency of Jacques Chirac. A ban on niqabs and burqas was accomplished by President Sarkozy. But it should be added that neither of those phenomena was particularly an actual policy challenge. They were more symbols and signals being sent to the far right precisely about what you're saying, a desire to project control over a situation that is frankly institutionally underdeveloped. And I would contest the interpretation of laïcité as being well, I would affirm what the other guest said in terms of the neutrality of the state and civil servants. However, we should remember that there are institutional opportunities afforded to religious communities to organize themselves and become incorporated under French law as it stands, including as a 1905 law corporation, which allows you to have tax exemption to set up religious organizations that are domestic. The 1959 law allows you to set up religious schools if there is enough of a demand for that. Catholics, Protestants, Jews, all enjoy religious freedom in France, including...
May I bring you back to the point that I mentioned, which was how does he differentiate himself from Marine Le Pen and Le Front National if he wants to win this election, but at the same time appear to be quite tough on extremism?
Well, it would mean going beyond the rhetorical sort of easy game of denouncing separatism or extremism, which everyone agrees with, and going a step further and thinking hard about how to take advantage of those exceptions to laïcité so that Islam can be more firmly anchored in the French countryside, including in Strasbourg, in Alsace and Lorraine, where, as the other guest mentioned, it is possible to create a theological department or theological seminary under French law. There are ways that he can make dossiers move that have been immobile for 2 decades simply by underscoring the urgency with which the reforms are needed. The vacuum, again, I would mention that Chechen refugee was wandering around in and picking up fatwas from who knows where is directly a result of the lack of religious authority in France.
Okay, so Macron might be being seen by those who support him anyway as being tough, a leader that they would like to see in the Élysée again in 2022. But Jacques and Riemann, whoever puts their hand up first can answer this one. I'm thinking about perhaps the boycott of French goods, a campaign that's going around at the moment. Will that help him portray himself as the leader who can deal with France under attack rather than the Muslim community itself under attack? Jacques.
Difficult question. The boycott came out of the blue, very surprised. At the same time, we know our religion is used by political leaders in the Middle East and in Turkey as a way to promote their own interest. And like we had an example of someone calling someone mad, and we know that narcissist people tend to accuse other people of their own failings. And the attack on France is at the same a lack of understanding. There's a lack of understanding, but at the same time they want to make political.
But could this help Emmanuel Macron himself, though, to be seen? Could it help Macron to be seen to be under attack from elsewhere?
Yes, in a way it won't. It won't diminish him. Yes, it obliges him to remain firm. But at the same time, there are some people who would say that maybe we've been too strong. The message that Macron delivered during the funeral of the teacher Samuel Paty, and the fact that we kept on displaying these caricatures, maybe that was going a bit far and it's damaging for French economic interest, and say that maybe there he should not have been as clear-minded. But at the same time, he was almost forced to be tough, because waiting in the wings, you have the right wing, the Republicans, as well as the National Front, who've been proposing all kinds of stupid measures which would inflame the Muslim community. But Marine Le Pen saying that actually this problem is a result of immigration. Immigration is the seedbed of terrorism, as she puts it. So he has to find, it's a tough balancing act. But at the same time,
indeed,
trying to reassure the Muslim community, and behind that, the French Council of Muslim Cult is actually backing.
So let me
sensible.
Let me come to Reem, if I may, because we only have a couple of minutes left. It's gone extremely quickly, I have to say. How do you stop this becoming an argument about secularism against Islam, the French state against one particular religion? How do you prevent that from becoming the narrative? This is for Reem.
I think first of all, I think the bigger question is, what does it mean to be French today? Some are weaponizing religion for their own political agenda, and some are weaponizing laïcité for their own political agenda. And what I find worrying is how our political elite believe that surfing on the far right wave can get them elected, and which speaks volume about the state of current affairs right now in France and the way we consider French Muslims.
Do me a favor, and just try and answer that question. How do we prevent it getting out of control and becoming the French state against Muslims?
By respecting our motto, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Because without this motto, we are nothing. And if we start to apply what we preach, maybe there is a way to get out of this terrible situation.
Jonathan, will it die down?
Yes, of course. It always does. We have to also remember that there are domestic uses for the outrage being fueled in the Muslim majority world. Leaders there also face public opinion pressures, also face elections of a sort, and therefore can be expected to play to their own domestic audiences, which, it might be added, sometimes include diasporas abroad. So those electorates, I think, are also a target of some of the current brouhaha. I believe that this will die down because every 10 years or every 5 years, something of this magnitude takes place. And it does usually spur some reform. My hope is that this actually leads to something to replace what is being cut off, which is to say the flow of imams and other trained scholars from the Muslim world, because if Macron doesn't have a plan to replace them, then the vacuum will only become more profound.
Jacques, one final quick one, if you would. You said that Macron is seen as weak. Will this make him appear to be strong?
I don't know if I said that Macron was seen as weak. Yes, he was perceived in a way as soft, and not weak, soft on Islamism. But he's realized that he had to tackle that issue because this issue was growing with the recent murders, etc. There's always events, and he has to be the standard bearer for the French model.
I'm so sorry. We don't have time for any more. It's always the worst question you could ask if you say to somebody, please keep it short. It's impossible to do that all the time. No, listen, many thanks to each and every one of you. I appreciate your time. I loved listening to what you had to say. So thank you for coming on the program, and thank you wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable. That is all we have time for now. We're on YouTube, Roundtable at TRT World on YouTube for all of our episodes if you want to catch up. But for now, from David Foster and the team, goodbye.